Welcome back to Unaborted with Seth Gruber today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We have been on the road a lot and we are about to build a new studio. And so we've kind of just been churning different kinds of episodes as I've been on the road or connecting with culture warrior friends around the country. And we had a really amazing Instagram live conversation the other day with my friends Brittany Mayer, Carrie Boller, and Melissa O'Connor of The Battle Cry, who you need to follow on Instagram, by the way, The Battle Cry. And these folks are cut from the same cloth as me and us here at the White Rose Resistance. And we took we dived into the shallow end, let's say, of the culture of death, the sexual revolution, the seeds of the sex ed movement and the pedophilic fringes of the liberal establishment and where that all came from and how that explains kind of where we're at today. So we talked about Alfred Kinsey. We talked about the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States. We talked about the UN being the precursor to Planned Parenthood's SIECUS, which is the most oldest organization behind all of the kooky pornographic sex ed that parents are finding in their kids' public schools all around America. All of this goes back a long ways. And then we dive into the church and the need for the bride of Christ to start waking up before it's too late. Enjoy this conversation. Please share it widely with your pastors. Everyone commenting on Instagram Live said this was a fire hose. This was stuff they had never heard before. And that's the problem, isn't it? That we don't know how we got here, and so we're fumbling and bumbling, and we don't know how to turn this American experiment around. Buckle up, you're in for a treat. I'm Seth Gruber, and this is Unaborted.
Seth, again, this is Seth Gruber from the White Rose Resistance, and he is an amazing friend and warrior brother. A lot of times we say at the end of the world, it's probably going to be us and Seth still standing, and some others too, but he's the real deal, and we love him and are so grateful for you to sit down with us. So Seth, why don't you just give us like a quick 30-second who you are and what you're doing, and then we'll go into all the meat and potatoes.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, I've been a pro-life activist since I was a fetus. My mother was the director of a pregnancy resource center while pregnant with me in Azusa, California, down the street from APU. And so if it's her body, her choice, and if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So therefore, all parts of the baby are part of the mother. Therefore, all babies my mother saved while the director of a pregnancy center I saved. Went to Whittier High School. I did my senior project on abortion, saw aborted baby images at 18 years old. Changed my life, knew it was my calling, went to Westmont College in Santa Barbara, a fake Christian college you should never send your children to that has pro-abortion professors on payroll and faculty. I exposed them for hiring pro-abortion professors and not taking a pro-life position. Graduated in 2014, started doing full-time pro-life speaking. Actually met Carrie and her awesome husband Kyle shortly after when I was a little nobody who couldn't even get into a church. And then left to start my own organization about a year ago. And we launched the White Rose Resistance publicly right after the overturn of Roe v. Wade.
So we're all on this educational journey together, and a lot of us are, at various points in the spectrum. But as we've recently come to learn about
the gender spectrum. Come on, use inclusive language.
Exactly. I need my points, my CEI points. So like Britt just said, we're super curious to hear from you how the gender cult and the history of Kinsey, Alfred Money, and Hugh Hefner, and then SIECUS and Margaret Sanger ties into Planned Parenthood and even the origins before that. So just let it rip.
Yeah, it all goes together. So we don't have time to frame the timbers appropriately. So I'm going to do as many powerful flashpoints as I can. But I want to give a teaser to everyone listening right now before we finish with an invitation for you to hear me tomorrow night at San Diego State University. But the teaser is we have a 4-part, it's almost like a mini doc, but it's a podcast, a 4-part podcast coming out in May. Each part will be like 45 minutes long or something crazy. And it's with a woman who's 90 years old named Claire Chambers, who I flew across the country to sit down with for 2.5 hours. And she wrote this book and she published it in 77. It's called The Sika Circle, A Humanist Revolution. I spent like $100 on this to get used on Amazon. They're hard to find. She started studying in 1970. So she spent 7 years researching to write this book. She was raising little ones. She was in her early 30s when she started researching.
Wow.
So she started researching before Roe v. Wade, before 73. Took 7 years to do it, published it in 77. First book of its kind at that time to connect all of the humanist dots, organizations, high priests of humanism, all the organizations, all sharing board members, all citing one another as scientific experts. They were just following the science. You go down this rabbit hole, it's disgusting. Now, I've been studying this stuff for years, actually, but the last year, I've really increased my, like I've been aware of Kinsey and Alfred Kinsey and John Money and Wardell Pomeroy and Mary Calderon and a lot of those people for actually some years now. But I threw my whole body down the rabbit hole about the last year. This stuff, it can be described as nothing other than red pilling. And yet most conservatives I meet who love the Lord and actually know a bit of their history look at me and go, huh? They have no idea. So we're going to do probably another White Rose Resistance live tour on all new content, probably next fall or spring, I would see, to do all of this, to connect all the pieces. So before we do, Abe Lincoln, right, good old honest Abe, he put this powerfully. He said, when we see a lot of framed timbers, different portions of which have been brought out at different times and places and by different workmen, let's call them Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James. And when we see these timbers framed together, joined together, and they exactly make the frame of a house, a mill, all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting, and all the lengths and proportions of different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, and not a piece too many or too few. In such a case, we find it impossible not to believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning and all worked upon a common plan or draft that was drawn up before the first brick was struck. In other words, when you see the intentionality of a political movement or a house or an institution, and it just seems too perfectly aligned, maybe you should go, maybe it wasn't a coincidence. And maybe there was actually like conversations going on behind the scenes. Maybe there were different colonels on different battlefronts in the culture war, but they all had walkie-talkies. And they were all communicating the same time and reporting to the same general with different colonels tasked on different battlefronts, but with the singular goal, working upon a common blueprint that was drawn up before the first sword was drawn. When you study the history of humanism, let's call it, guys, okay? You can call it neo-Malthusianism, you can call it Bill Gatesism, you can call it Darwinism, secular progressivism, it's all the same freaking thing. And you see the intentional alignments that there are. It's not a coincidence. Okay, so where could we even start? Because we only have, 20 minutes left. And like I said, you guys are going to go bonkers over this 2.5-hour podcast we got coming out in May. And so you guys can share that when it comes out. But the beginning of the sex ed movement as we know it today actually goes back to the United Nations itself. So SIECUS, the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, which was started by Planned Parenthood's medical director, Mary Calderon, who leaves Planned Parenthood in 1964 to found SIECUS with seed money from Hugh Hefner and other millionaires and billionaires like the Rockefeller Foundation. And one of her first board members was named Wardell Pomeroy, who would later be the executive director of the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, renamed
Kinsey
Institute. Alfred, after that demon passed away, it was renamed after him. But so you got one of the board members of SIECUS, also later the executive director of the Kinsey Institute. So already there's your first little flashpoint I've done for you. The connection between the pedophilic, follow the science expertise and the very organization that would sort of politicize and institutionalize that science into the sex ed movement as we know it today. So there's one little flashpoint there. But SIECUS doesn't, the sex ed movement, comprehensive sexuality education, doesn't actually start with SIECUS. It actually starts with the United Nations. And so, shocker, right? As what did we find out 2 days ago? That the United Nations is pushing to decriminalize sex between children and adults.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, this Instagram Live, isn't this providential timing? So we're going to trace this back to the United Nations right now. when 2 days ago they just proved what I'm about to say, that bad seed yields a bitter harvest. And so they're still reaping that bitter harvest, and we're going to go back to the bad seed right now.
We've been looking at, Kinsey and money and Kinseyism. And one of the things that shocked us is really like, that's where you see like the change of the American landscape, in terms of what we view as normal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he was
goal.
Pushing was absolutely pedophilia. That was what the data collection was all based on abuse of children and pedophilia. And then you have money come in, and he actually starts trying the thoughts of Kinsey and medicalizing it. But it was always about this trans age. It wasn't just transgender. It was a whole end goal that now we're seeing the UN today, lo and behold, pick up. So go ahead and take us there.
Yes.
Where does this come from?
Framing the timbers, ladies, framing the timbers. That's what we're doing, right? Okay, so G. Brock Chisholm was the former head of the World Health Organization. Most people don't know that name because this goes back to like the 40s and 50s. G. Brock Chisholm, who was leading the World Health Organization, really participated early on in laying the foundation for what we today call sex ed, or comprehensive sexuality education. And he laid that foundation with Julian Huxley. Now, Julian Huxley led the UNESCO, United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization, UNESCO, United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Okay, and Julian Huxley was a rabid eugenicist, okay, a rabid sexual deviant. And this is interesting, right? You go back to bad seed, bitter harvest, right? Julian Huxley's brother is Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. Okay, now wait for it. You guys ready for this? Their grandfather was Thomas Huxley. Okay, now listen, get ready for this. One of the first adherents to Darwin's theory of evolution, and Julian and Aldous Huxley's grandpapa, Thomas Huxley, was so influential in modernizing and institutionalizing Darwin's ideas into the evolutionist Darwin movement that he was referred in the public by the nickname Darwin's Bulldog, because he was like a bulldog for the movement. Right? So yes, of course, because might makes right, survival of the fittest, right? We're just like animals. And so just like animals, you should indulge every sexual appetite and desire that you have whenever you have it. You start seeing all of this goes back to Darwinism, Neo-Malthusianism, and ultimately the detaching Christianity to replace Christianity with the religion of humanism. So he was called Darwin's Bulldog, whose grandson is leading UNESCO, okay, who, with Julian Huxley, with the director of the World Health Organization, G. Brock Chisholm, lays the first kind of early seeds of comprehensive sexuality education. So G. Brock Chisholm was invited to DC by way of invitation by the communist Alger Hiss, which everyone should know that name, to give 3 lectures on sex ed in DC. And there, Chisholm advocated for starting sex ed as early as the 4th grade, okay? And he, quote, here's what he said. He said, quote, he insisted on the eradication of the way of the elders. Which is just another way of saying, like, yeah, that old Judeo-Christian worldview, those old fundamentalists that believe human beings have dignity and the sanctity of life. And he also called for, quote, the eradication of the concept of right and wrong. And you'll notice this about all of the people behind the sex ed movement. They were all Darwinists and relativists, right? And so the belief was that the right or wrongness of an action was not gauged in the action itself. The right or wrongness of an act was only gauged to the degree that it brought pleasure and joy or pain and regret. So hence, what's the central phrase of the sexual revolution?
Yep, right.
If it feels good, do it. So this is some of the early seeds of all of this, okay?
And
so that's really
sorry,
where
Seth,
it starts. And then
I'm sorry, what year was that when he was invited to DC?
Yeah, that was in
so right before
that's where we really saw all of this. And he's touring the legislature.
Right when he's publishing Sexuality in the Human Male.
Can you tell us
That's
his name
you
again?
guys know
Seth?
exactly. The director of the World Health Organization was
This is the guy
G.
that's
Brock
traveling
Chisholm.
in the 40s. He comes to DC. Okay.
He was invited. He was laying the foundation of sex ed with Julian Huxley, who led UNESCO, but he was invited by his communist friend Alger Hiss to come to DC and give 3 lectures on advocating for sex and starting in the 4th grade. Okay, so then Mary Calderon, the name that you know, because she's the founder of SIECUS, right? And that's why my friend Claire Chambers, her book's literally called The SIECUS Circle, okay? And just as a 5-minute flashpoint here, SIECUS is the first organization of its kind. So when you get Health Connected Teen Talk and all of these other branches that are the organizations today writing the kooky pornographic sex ed, they're all branches off of the tree of SIECUS, okay? Whose roots are all the humanist revolution, okay? But SIECUS is really kind of stands out as this trunk and one of the more significant organizations to spawn during and out of the sexual revolution. So Mary Calderon goes to a symposium on sex education in Europe in '64, months before SIECUS was founded, y'all. She goes to this symposium on sex education, sponsored by UNESCO, the United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization, who was at that time being led by Julian Huxley. Okay, so and there you have the Swedish delegates that show up to this symposium on sex education, sponsored by the United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization. Now, this is significant because Sweden has always led the way internationally in early humanist rot and bullshit things. So in 1938, Sweden became the first free nation in Christendom to revert to pre-Christian abortion legislation and to institutionalize Planned Parenthood sex education and family limitation programs. 1938, ladies. So Sweden has always led the way in cultural decay internationally. So the reason I'm saying that is I'm saying it shouldn't surprise us, okay, that the Swedish delegates at the UNESCO-sponsored symposium on sex education come with a blueprint for what SIECUS, for what sex ed should look like internationally. Months later, when Mary Calderon found SIECUS, the blueprint, the mission, the vision, and the deliverables are almost a direct copy-paste from the Swedish delegates' blueprint for sex ed that they brought to the symposium on sex education months before she found SIECUS. So the United Nations was kind of leading the way with a lot of this stuff before the organization that we kind of look to today as the major organization behind all of this pornographic kooky sex ed in the schools is even founded. Okay, so now we're starting to frame the timbers a little bit here. Now, Mary Calderon. Now, this is really, really fascinating, right? Mary Calderon's husband is Frank Calderon, okay? Frank Calderon. And at the time, just prior to her founding SIECUS, Frank Calderon is serving as none other than the chief administrator for G. Brock Chisholm, the director of the World Health Organization, who had gone to DC to deliver some of the first lectures that politically and publicly advocated for starting sex ed in the 4th grade and calling for the eradication of the way of the elders. Mary Calderon, the founder of SIECUS, her freaking husband, is working as the chief administrator for G. Brock Chisholm of the World Health Organization. So this is just like I said, we don't have time to go down the full rabbit hole, but I'm just trying to frame some of these lumber pieces and timbers for your listeners so you can kind of see how far back this kind of
so Seth,
is that helpful?
Yeah.
I can go for another hour.
Well,
I
have a question about, like, you know, you see this all collide in this moment so much further back than we would have thought. And would you ever agree that we lost World War II and it just looked different in like a worldwide infiltration into America, and we're not actually a free country, because that's what we're seeing from 2020 on. We can see it now. What are your thoughts on that?
So what she's asking is something we've discussed with, we see so much, like specifically with Kinsey, right? And he has his Nazi pedophile that he's sourcing all of these horrific war crimes against children, and he's sourcing that and he's calling it data, and then America is embracing it. And we see so much of the Nazi infiltration into our sex education and really reforming like America as we know it, like changing the whole landscape. So the question is, you know, we say like we won, you know, World War II, but did we really, or does it just look different now?
Oh, Right, totally. Yeah, that's well said. Well, I mean, what is what do we say about liberty? Liberty is the wise restraints that make men free, right? Liberty is not the freedom to do whatever you want; it's the freedom to do as you ought. But ought implies a moral framework. Ought implies objective reality, objective truth. Because if you ought to do something, that also means there's things you ought not to do. And all of those things imply objectivism, an objective moral framework of reality, wherein through our faculties of reason, we can actually know what is good and false, and what is true and beautiful, what is evil and good. And so all of this very early on was an early proxy war, kind of against the very religion that provided that moral framework to keep man free in the first place. So yeah, I guess what I would say to your question, Alyssa, is that things happen gradually, then suddenly, just like bankruptcy. And so, when a guy goes bankrupt, it's like, oh, how did this happen? It's like, well, brother, there was probably a series of decisions you were making for some time that led to said bankruptcy. I think that there's been a series of decisions that have been making us less and less free for many, many, many decades. And then in the last few years, we're kind of watching that unfold on the scene in a major way. But everything was already brewing under the surface of the American culture.
It looks like we never really got rid of
I don't know if that helps.
Like that. Let's talk about the spiritual realm for a second. Just what we saw with Nazi, the rise of the Reich. Sophie is who your organization is named after. She was just an incredible human who stood up against what Hitler was doing and called it for what it was, and she was executed because of that. She was the righteous resistance of that time.
That's right. Yeah.
But when we are studying and looking at where America went wrong in terms of the gender ideology cult now coming in and just claiming so much territory in America, and what you're saying, like it's slow, but then it's sudden, where we're looking at drag queens spreading their legs in front of babies, and that's supposed to be normal, and like little kids getting body parts mutilated. Well, it looks like there's a spiritual entity behind it, and it's that same spiritual demon, the demonic that was at play in Germany. So it's almost like we won the war and then we embraced that darkness over here. We just brought it over to America, and enter Alfred Kinsey and John Money and Hugh Hefner and Planned Parenthood. And it's like, well, did we ever even win, or did we just bring the demon over here to America? So why don't you catch us from the point of, you have Mary Calderon, she goes to the symposium in Europe, she hears from the Swedes that it's cool to kick Christ out and to be post-Christian, and let's like get on this whole sexual liberation movement. And then we're in about the 40s over here, right? No, that was 64 that she goes over there. So we already have Alfred Kinsey, who's published his book, which is Causing Waves, because all the broken men have come back from war and they're looking for a drug. And he's like, hey, you can like have lots of sex and there's no objective right or wrong. Then you have Money saying, hey, and if you still feel really bad, like we can cut you up and turn you into whatever gender you want to be. And there's something called trans age too. From that point forward, what do we see in terms of the connection between the abortion machine and the gender ideology cult? Is it connected, or are they totally separate?
So we actually have to go a few more 1,000 feet higher than that, actually. One of the things you guys have noticed about the liberal establishment is how they all seem to be on the same team of the population reduction movement, population limitation, right? There's too many people on planet Earth, and so Mother Gaia is very angry, right? The sun god, he's pissed, so you got to sterilize people or you got to kill them. Otherwise, you're going to pay the penalties. And so, one example of this is Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the book, The Population Bomb, in, I believe, 1964 or 65. It's 63 or 64. And which isn't that interesting, right? Very similar time that CICUS gets founded. Paul Ehrlich writes The Population Bomb. And he claims that if we don't significantly curb and reduce the world population, within 10 years, we'll have worldwide starvation. And so he's repeating Thomas Malthus's lies from the late 1700s and early 1800s. By the year I was born, 1991, the world population had doubled from the time he wrote that book. Malnutrition was at an all-time low, and we were the fattest generation in American history. So follow the science, follow the science. It's like, I feel like the Princess Bride. I'm like, I don't think that word means what you think it means. But the reason I said that is because Paul Ehrlich, guess what, sat on the board of Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood President Alan Guttmacher, who was the president of Planned Parenthood in the early 60s, and when Roe v. Wade came down, attended international conferences on the population limitation movement. The president of Planned Parenthood before Roe is going overseas to Europe to attend these. We got to curb overpopulation. So like the abortion industry has always been in bed with these people. So now wait, I know I wasn't as narrow of an answer you looking for, but it's because I actually had to take us about 20,000 feet higher in the political landscape. And so in 1967, 3 years after SIECUS is founded, there's an international conference of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. And this is 67. So this is hosted by the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Okay, IPPF. Okay, 67. And at this conference, British psychiatrist G.M. Carstairs says this. This is fascinating. Oh, and this was quoted in the UNESCO Quarterly in 68, the United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization. Here's what he said. When, because of increasing overpopulation, the standards of living actually decline at the very time when people's aspirations have been raised, the stage is set for further outbreaks of collective irrationality and violence, right? If you don't give us all your political rights to solve the sun god and overpopulation, then there's going to be massive worldwide chaos. It is imperative that we recognize the gravity of this threat, he says. Remember, again, this is being said at a Planned Parenthood conference, guys, because mankind today possesses weapons of such destructive power that the world cannot afford to risk outbreaks of mass violence. And yet the lesson of history points to just such a disaster, unless population control can be achieved, end quote. Now pause, listen. So here's the question, friends. How would Planned Parenthood and the humanist revolutionaries of the 1950s and 1960s, how would they prevent such an impending disaster that's looming over us? Well, one of the co-founders of SIECUS, Lester Kirkendall, would one time say the quiet part out loud and give away the entire freaking agenda and goal. By the way, aren't you so grateful for when the left does this, when they say the quiet part out loud? Like, the most recent example was when Jane Fonda was like, maybe we should murder pro-life politicians. And the other host on The View was like, don't say that. They're going to cut that up and take it out of context. Right. So Lester Kirkendall did this in 65. Now, listen, who the frick was Lester Kirkendall? Okay. He was one of the co-founders. Like, it wasn't just Mary Calderon. That's what you have to understand. When it was founded, it's not like she founded it and then immediately like called up her friends to become board members. There were multiple men who were actually co-founders at the time that the articles of incorporation were submitted. Okay, so Lester Kirkendall was one of those men, and the reason I'm going to just do a brief little expose on him is for this reason, my dear friends. He is one of the more significant figures to have spawned out of the sexual revolution. When you go down this rabbit hole, it's like Kirkendall, Lester Kirkendall, you know, who the hell is this dude? Like, his name keeps popping up everywhere. He's like on everyone's board. He's like he's a funder and financier of like this organization and then this organization. You're like, who the hell is Lester Kirkendall? Okay, so that's why we have to do this. So he represented the field of, quote, family life education at the founding of SIECUS. Guys, family life education was just a phrase that was used in the early 50s to describe the early seeds of sexuality education. Okay, it was like the state and schools should be tasked with family life education, not the parents. So that's not a good phrase. Okay, and he was also active in Planned Parenthood. In 1966, Lester Kirkendall assumed dictatorship of the American Humanist Association, that has said is one of those goals, quote, the eradication of God, which is always hilarious because have you noticed about these? I'm sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox. I'm having too much fun here. Have you noticed about these people? They're always like, God doesn't exist. And I also really hate him. It's like, dude, it's like, man, liberalism does really weird things to the brain. So that's the American Humanist Association, right, which is dedicated to the eradication of God from the universe. In 1977, he served in dual capacity as a board member of AHA, the American Humanist Association, and on the editorial board of the American Humanist Association's official voice, the Humanist Magazine. The Humanist Magazine, guys, published people like Alger Hiss, Roger Baldwin, the co-founder of the ACLU, who was at those early gatherings filled with wine and sex with Margaret Sanger in Greenwich Village, New York in the early 1900s. Roger Baldwin was there. And from that movement spawned a lot of those revolutionaries. Lester Kirkendall co-authored a book with identified communist Isidore Rubin, also one of the board members of SIECUS. He co-wrote a book with Isidore Rubin entitled, ready for this, Sex in the Adolescent Years, New Directors in Guiding and Teaching Youth. So Kirkendall's like co-authoring these early books about, right, how to sexualize children. And he served on the staff of the periodical magazine,
Yeah.
Sexology. I'm almost done here. And Sexology had other board members,
Yeah.
Wow.
such as
Yeah.
John Money,
Yeah.
Wardell Pomeroy, and Isidore Rubin. And he's listed as a financial contributor to the Temple of Understanding, which gets to the occult. We don't have time for that right now. And Lester Kirkendall was also a board member of Oregon State's Planned Parenthood organization. Okay, so what did Lester Kirkendall say out loud? What was the quiet part he said out loud? Remember, what are we asking right now? How are they going to stop this overpopulation sun god from wiping out the earth? Lester Kirkendall would say none other, my dear friends, than sex ed is the linchpin upon which the population limitation movement swings. That's my paraphrase. Let me quote him for you. Okay, so here is Kirkendall, Lester Kirkendall, writing in, this was the year, this was in 68, I believe. Here's what he says. We demonstrated that effective contraceptive methods and, in the long run, population control were linked closely with physiological knowledge about sex, a capacity for free discussion and attitudes towards sex roles and sex itself. Listen, here it comes. Sex education is thus clearly tied in a socially significant way to family planning and population limitation policy. So this is not some lower lackey of the sexual revolutionaries and high priests of humanism. Lester Kirkendall is one of the architects of the sexual revolution and co-founder of SECUS, who said, we realized in our study that to bring about the population limitation movement, the worldwide reduction of the world's population, all of this was clearly tied to more liberal ideas about sex. So how do we make sense of this? Because population control is best achieved when people willingly participate, right? If they willingly participate through the widespread use of birth control. But birth control necessarily assumes more liberal ideas about sex. And those more liberal ideas are planted in the minds of young children very early through comprehensive sexuality education, SECUS style.
Okay, so here's my question right off the bat. You've got one idea here saying sun god's gonna, like, we're all gonna die. We need population control. Oh no, what are we gonna do? Because all these sweet American families are in general living under the Christian ethic, Christian morality. They're populating the earth, be fruitful and multiply. What are we going to do? Because population control. And then on the other hand, you have the sexual revolution stepping in and saying, like, have all the sex you want, enjoy it. Hugh Hefner is famous for saying fornicate early, fornicate often, and fornicate, what was the third? Fornicate early, often, with everyone, something like that. So you've got two opposing, really, like they're in opposition of each other, because you have one saying we need population control. We have the other saying, like, have all the sex you want. Well, we know what happens when you have sex. So give us the bridge. How do you bridge those two ideologies, which you're saying are connected? Then how are they connected and not in opposition?
Yeah, so here's something that I think a lot of conservatives are not really aware of about these high priests of humanism, and that is this: the birth control contraception movement was never birthed with the intention of providing a bulletproof way to plan your parenthood. It was always used as a way to encourage sexual chaos and to break down sexual and societal mores. The reason I'm saying that is because a lot of conservatives, I think, struggle with the same fork in the road, seemingly contradictory culture war routes that you just laid out by saying, well, aren't those dual visions? No, because I'm not convinced that these people intended for birth control and contraception to actually work. I think it was a cash cow to sell things they knew wouldn't work in the first place, to promise the fruits of the sexual revolution, which is orgasms without responsibility, but knowing full well that said birth control and contraception would not work in the long run very well anyways. Therefore, the culture could fall back onto the birth control linchpin, abortion. So they profit on the front end with contraception that will inevitably fail, and that encourages sexual chaos. And they profit on the back end because when it does inevitably fail, they can then also profit off of abortion itself, and they're still limiting the population. Because if the birth control doesn't prevent the population growth, then killing the baby will. And causing such sexual chaos and planting those early seeds in the minds of Americans, which is what, that we have the right to orgasms without responsibility. That's what contraception convinced us of, right? It ripped sex from its procreative telos and put the culture of death on steroids. So when you don't consent to pregnancy, then if you don't consent to pregnancy because you're on birth control, then gosh dang it, I have a right to make difficult life problems just go away. And that if that difficult life problem is a person, a baby, then so be it, because Margaret Sanger told me in 1915, no gods and no masters, which was just a repetition of the serpent in Genesis 3, which Whittaker Chambers in his book Witness, the former communist, would say all of the communist revolution actually kind of was based on that first lie in the garden, which was that ye shall be as gods. And this is why Francis Schaeffer said humanism is placing man at the center of all things and making him the measure of all things. So in other words, to give a long-winded answer, which I love it. I'm sorry, Brittany, to your question, it was always just chaos. It was always just chaos, because for them, it wasn't contradictory. And we have an Instagram post, if you guys go through my Instagram, where we cite a lot of Planned Parenthood people back from the 80s and 70s, actually logging and citing how much birth control failed. And today, because what do they say today? That Planned Parenthood has always claimed that their birth control programs are designed to prevent the need for abortion, right? Because they argue that contraceptive services lower unwanted pregnancy rates. But really, when you start looking at this stuff, it actually just raised them, because when women get on birth control early and they stay on it for like a decade or more, it is actually guaranteed that they will eventually get pregnant. And now once they do, they've been conditioned mentally and politically and culturally to believe that they have the right to orgasms without responsibility. They've been dehumanizing themselves through multiple partner sex. And now it's easy to dehumanize the child whose only fault is coming into existence. So anyways, I don't know, maybe that's the beginning.
I think that's a great answer. And really it's like the large scale, what you see is like, because let's look at this in terms of like ideologies. You have America that's built on family, right? Like when they send over the boys and the families on the Mayflower and you start chopping down trees, they literally started sending over women for the men who came over here doing the manual labor, because they knew there was a need as the foundation of a nation to have family. And so if you twist gender to where everything's the same and sex is meaningless because just whatever feels good, then you've actually torn apart the whole structure of family, which is Marxist in nature. It's saying that the family unit, these ideas that are Judeo-Christian, they're archaic, they're no longer needed. And now you have the spiritual realm being open because you've kicked out Jesus and the origin of truth. And in that, the enemy comes to, steal, kill, and destroy. So of course, you're going to see complete destruction of the innocence and murder rates and murder being abortion, right? So on the bigger scale, you're seeing like a complete rewriting and rewiring of America. It's bigger than abortion as an isolated thing.
That's right. Oh, and by the way, most of these people involved with the sexual revolution and with the sex ed movement and the abortion movement, most of them were either communists or they had multiple links to communist front organizations. And that's always fascinating too. It kind of goes to show you how these people were all working together. But let me just bolster Brittany's point. Let me just prove to you, everyone listening, how true what she just said was, okay? Because I like to do that, because here's the facts behind Brittany's fire. So Isidore Rubin, who again I told you co-wrote that book with Lester Kirkendall about sexualizing children, right? What do you call it? Like adolescent sex. Isidore Rubin, a identified communist, once quoted a Sikh recommended author So SIECUS, what you got to understand about SIECUS is that they started publishing SIECUS study guides within a few months of founding. In their first 4 years, they rolled out they called them SIECUS study guides. And guys, what this is, all you need to know about this is that was the precursor to sensitivity training. That was the precursor to sensitivity training, right? When you role play these scenarios in the classrooms, right? It's pure discussion, but they're talking about the most like sexually inappropriate, titillating conversations, right? It's a way to break down inhibitions so that ideas that were previously not entertained as sort of socially acceptable are now actually masqueraded as just the norm, right? Because these people's belief is that there was no sexual taboos. There was no kind of sexual activity that was immoral, right? Right? Why? Because there is no morality. There is no objective truth structure. And so Isidore Rubin, one of the co-founders, gosh dang it, of SIECUS, quotes one of their recommended authors, because they would publish curriculum for schools early on to be used. So they had their recommended scientific authors. And one of those authors was named Judson Landis. Judson Landis. And here is SIECUS co-founder Isidore Rubin quoting Judson Landis. Okay, listen to this. When acts are no longer forbidden to all, when the individual is authorized to decide whether or not violation will be advantageous, the moral code vanishes. The moral code vanishes. And then you had Rubin writing in SIECUS study guide number 10. So again, this is the same communist and SIECUS board member and co-founder. Quote, the right of the individual to engage in any form of sex behavior. Now, you'll notice this as we start to make a turn towards Kinsey and this movement. You'll notice they always use the word individual or sexual being. They never use the term human or child or person. It's always the term individual or sexual being. And so Rubin would write and advise teachers to, quote, their acceptance of truth as a core value would imply that the effect of all sex practices would be described in the classroom as objectively and scientifically as possible, whether or not the results conformed to the official mores or to a particular social code. And then Mary Calderon would write in 66, she would say, we should teach our children that this force of sexuality can and must be integrated into the total personality of the individual. And that people must learn to manage it and use it creatively and constructively in relationship with one another as men and women. The best program I know for doing this is the one I helped formulate for SIECUS. She wrote that in the Philadelphia Inquirer magazine on January 2nd, 1966. So we can start, if you want, we're probably done with time, but that would be where we would turn towards the language and the relationships with the Kinsey Institute or the Institute for Sex Research and their relationships.
Seth, you're so brilliant. I feel like we could sit with you for hours and hours and days and days. And we're going to wrap up here in the next few minutes. Carrie, if you have to jump off, feel free to jump off. But I had two more questions that I just want to loop back on with where we started in all of this. Which you talked about the framing, that there's too much to overlook and just say, oh, it just ironically fit together. You know, Alfred Kinsey, John Money, Hugh Hefner, Margaret Sanger, Mary Calderon. It just happened to all fit really well. You were like, no, that shows the intentionality before the design. Right. So my question, I have two questions. And the first one that I want to ask you is, if there was intentionality in the design before that first frame was laid, what was the end goal? What was it?
Yes. Yes. Come on, Seth. Come on.
That's my question too. That's everybody's question on the feet on the line.
Well, no, I mean, I think I think I already teased it actually. And that's why the American Humanist Association says that they exist. For the eradication of God from the universe. And this is why the phrase that I'm most popular for saying, that people love to quote the most, and I think I heard someone else say it originally actually, but that the culture war was always a proxy war for a deeper spiritual war, right? The enemy of our souls doesn't stop his agenda at the line of politics, like Rick Warren and Ed Stetzer all think so. Like, oh, I guess I can't go any further. I brushed up against the line of politics. Oh, I'm Satan. I can't violate the Johnson Amendment. What the hell are you talking about? No, Satan's happy to work through any institution or organization to upend society, to break it all down, because as one demon named Baphomet would say, solve coagula, which in Latin means to break everything down so you can remake or rebuild it. There's a famous demon named Baphomet who looks like a transgender pig. And so it has like a pig head and it horns, because every child sacrificed God in all of human history has always had horns. It looks like a bull. And then he has boobs, and then he has very masculine looking arms and legs. So you got the transgender appearance, right? And then you've got the animal thing, right? Because as Chesterton would say, wherever there is animal worship, there will be human sacrifice. There you go. And written on the arms of this famous demon are the words "solve coagula," which means to break everything down so that you can remake it. That literally could not better describe the entire secular moral revolution and all of their high priests and pontiffs. So when they say that God doesn't exist, but they also want to eradicate God from the universe, maybe you should start scratching your head and going, maybe the Bible was right when it said eternity is written on the heart of man and God's rain falls on the just and the unjust. And we all freaking know there's a God, because only a PhD Yale University professor could be so stupid as to say that a gorgeous painting or building screams a creator, but the very nature of human beings doesn't. You have to have your head so far up your own rectum, it's coming out your face again to say things like that. Only liberalism can do that to the brain. Only leftism, humanism, neo-Malthusianism, and Darwinism can do that to the brain. And so the American Humanist Association is one of the last pieces of this puzzle that we'll get to another time, because all of these people were a part of, had spawned out of, or had shared funding of the American Humanist Association. And so I'll end with this. A special committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations appointed by the 83rd Congress made an exhaustive investigation into the Institute for Sex Research while Kinsey was still its executive director. And here's what they concluded, quote, "The foundation supported Kinsey reports had been deliberately designed as an assault on the Judeo-Christian morality." Guys, that was decades and decades and decades ago. A special committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations appointed by the 83rd Congress going, holy moly, this couldn't be more obvious. You just want to get rid of God or anything that resembles an objective moral framework and universe to which we're all beholden and to which we will be accountable. All of this was a proxy war attack against Christianity the entire time. And I have a new talk I'm working on right now that's probably 2 hours long if I were to get through all of the notes, that I got to decide the best venue to give that in, because most people can't sit that long. And we're going to expose another 2 hours of this stuff, because once you start seeing the intentional design of our current culture of death, we find it impossible to believe that Franklin and Roger and Stephen and James did not all understand one another from the beginning, and we're not working upon a common blueprint or plan drawn up.
So here's my final question, and then Carrie, you can shoot my last question with all of this, Seth, is, and you played into it perfectly, is the end goal was always the destruction of the Christian God, the King of Kings. It was to destroy what America was built on, to take territory that was claimed, and to inject the demonic back into what had been claimed as Christian by and large. So knowing that that was the end goal, that, you look back at like the books that our kids in early America were using in their schoolhouses, it was catechism, it was Bible. That's what our kids were learning. And we very methodically, we picked God, the Christian God, out. We took out the 10 Commandments, we took out prayer, we took out the catechism. And as we did that, there was a vacuum, and we started filling it with all the junk of Psychus, which we now know is fully rooted in the demonic. It's rooted in Ishtar, it's rooted in Baal, it's rooted in Baphomet. And so we see that. My question, and I think this is so important, and I hope if you're listening and you have a friend that's a pastor or your pastor, you share this, is twofold. What were the churches doing? And what can the churches do now? Because if this truly was the Trojan horse proxy war, it was a Trojan horse full of demons that came over to America. Tell me what the churches were doing at the time, and what can the churches do now?
And don't hold back.
I knew this would be a problem. I knew this would be a problem. I got so much to say, but we're gonna have you guys on the podcast soon, and so just to tease that for people, we're gonna take a deep dive, and we're gonna talk about the strange providential naming of people, like Wiener. Why is his name Wiener? Why does his name have to be Wiener? Why does the dude behind all of the pornographic kooky abortion sex ed in California, one of the most sexual degenerate little pieces of human poop behind all of the stuff happening in California, why does his last name have to be Wiener? Maybe sometimes providence is when God winks. All nature is but art unknown to thee. All chance direction which thou canst not see. To quote Alexander Pope. All chance direction, which thou canst not see. Maybe it's direction that guy's freaking name is Wiener. And I'm going to ask you guys about that when you come onto my podcast. Why is it that the freaking Polish Nazi child rapist, why is his last name Balusak? Why? Why is his last name Balusak? It sounds like ball and sack. And he was giving children the option between him or the gas chambers. And then he sent his data on raping children to Kinsey. Okay, anyway, I'm getting carried away. But so Brittany's question, what were the church doing? What the hell is going on? The the Johnson Amendment was passed in 1954. Right, so this is where we get this idea of a separation of church and state. The Johnson Amendment, right, which said that, like, oh, you churches, you're not allowed to endorse candidates. You're not allowed to tell people how to vote. The Johnson Amendment, which was explicitly used to remove the Bible and prayer from schools in America. Okay, now I'm going to answer Brittany's question. Within 4 years of the Johnson Amendment being passed, go fact check me, Reuters, 10 Pinocchios, and all this, guys. 1954 is the Johnson Amendment. 4 years later, in 1958, the American Humanist Association drafts an action plan on how to send their high priests and pontiffs and lackeys. Someone just said wrong. Okay, well, you can go fact check it. It's 1954. That was the Johnson Amendment. They go send their lackeys in this action plan on how to identify, find, and expose any Christians in schools that were praying, holding any type of worship or religious services, or had prayer in the schools. The American Humanist Association, guys, was so dogmatic and committed to their faith that they weren't waiting for an example to arise of, like, a teacher who was found praying before school. They drafted an action plan within 4 years of the Johnson Amendment to say, hunt, search, destroy, right? Go find any examples of this type of Christian activity happening in the schools. And then, quote, ready for this? To what? To, quote, challenge its constitutionality. Look how dogmatic and committed they were to their religion within 4 years of the political ticket they needed, the Johnson Amendment, giving them the power to be able to put under church discipline of the Church of Humanism, to put under church discipline anyone who dared talk about Christianity. And yet when SECUS was founded, in their Articles of Incorporation, which I've read, they say in their Articles of Incorporation that SECUS exists for, and they say, like, political, social reasons and stuff. But the first one they say is for religious reasons, to which we have to ask, which religion? The religion of humanism. These people have been religious the entire time. They've known it the entire time. So the question is not, will there be a dominant religion or morality? The question is whose. And so what was the church doing? They were asleep. They were living under the spell of the Johnson Amendment. They were like Lot, and they would only speak as much truth as the spirit of the age allowed them, lest they lost their 501c3 statuses. So they'd give up the posterity to the sexual moral revolution and their sexual degenerate pedophilic demons so that they could preach the gospel. The children born, unborn, and yet to be born became a sacrificial lamb on churches' 501c3 statuses and ability to say true things and say our message, because we don't want to compromise our message. And so I'll finish with this. R.J. Rushdoony, the father of the modern homeschool movement, R.J. Rushdoony put this better than anyone else. And oh, if the freaking church would have listened to R.J. Rushdoony voices and Chesterton voices. He said, dominion, that's the answer. Churches were not exercising dominion, but the Church of Humanism was. Here's what he says. Dominion does not disappear when a man renounces it. It is simply transferred to another person, perhaps to his wife, children, employer, or the state, where the individual surrenders his due dominion, where the family abdicates it, and the worker and employer reduce it. There another party, usually the state, concentrates that dominion. Where organized society surrenders power, the mob gains it, proportionate to the surrender. To the degree that we abdicate is the same degree that the enemy takes that ground, because we were under the spell of the Johnson Amendment, and we wanted our blue Instagram and Twitter verified check marks. We wanted a place at the table. We wanted Christianity to be respectable. We wanted to eat crumbs that were tossed to us from the worldly leaders.
I got chills.
Yeah, that's.
There you.
So my question is, Seth, what do people do if they're going to a church that does not speak out against evil?
Graciously challenge your pastor and ask to meet with him. And then if he repeatedly refuses to take these things seriously, if he refuses to preach the full counsel of God, if he refuses to explain to the bride of Christ how the full counsel of God means that Christ's life, death, and resurrection, the former fetus who entered human history in a uterus and predicted and pulled off his own resurrection, if that doesn't have anything to say to the cultural issues of the day, if that freaking event doesn't mean anything to how you understand your time and space that you live in, if the greatest former fetus to have ever existed, who predicted and pulled off his own resurrection, doesn't give you lenses through which to see and understand the world, then that pastor is subtly and subconsciously communicating to his congregation that Christianity is not big enough for your questions. Christ can't handle your questions. He is not large enough to provide the kind of spiritual and political clarity that you're looking for. Go find that answer from another faith, and they will. And you will send those young people in particular who are so confused in this sexualized mob of a culture into the arms of the religion of humanism to find clarity on issues that you as the shepherd refuse to bring. So if your pastor is not going to begin taking these things seriously, they're a waste of time. They've abdicated their pulpit and they need to step down. They're a waste of time, they're a waste of ministry, and they're a waste of the tithing that people have given to advance the kingdom of God. But do it graciously, do it kindly, do it respectfully. Try 2 or 3 times. And if nothing happens, shake the dust off.
Thank you so much.
Well, I don't know if we can top that ending.
You have us crying.
We're out.
How can people find you? And then we'll finish it out with Carrie's question, and then you can close us out, Seth, and we can let you go.
Okay, no, you guys are so kind. You guys are warriors. And I think it's providential that we've all been going down this rabbit hole kind of at the same time. And so I fully expect the White Rose Resistance to be partnering with and doing some type of work with the battle cry at some point. Because I think we're cut from the same cloth, and I think that the secular progressive moral revolutionary pedophilic sexual deviants will start manifesting their inner transgender legions if our organizations team up and start pushing back. And then you can connect with me at thewhiterose.life, www.thewhiterose.life. And my Instagram is just Seth Gruber Official or thewhiterose.life. We're rebuilding the anti-Nazi Christian resistance movement called the White Rose Resistance for this generation against our silent but far more deadly Holocaust of abortion, to build the army of Christian resistance to the culture of death that they dreamed of but never saw realized, because these people have always understood that the church was the greatest threat to their political regime. They knew that. It was only the Christians that seemingly did not know that. And so it's time for us to adopt that mantle, to be involved, to push back, to be stewards of what God has given us. That's what we're building. If you want to get involved with that, we're going to be spicy Elijah mocking the spirit of Baal cultural revolutionaries who are trying to put ourselves out of a job so our children and grandchildren are not fighting this battle. And you guys believe the same things. That's why I'll always come on any kind of event or live with you guys. I'm so grateful for your courage as mama bears or papa bears. I'm sorry, I probably assumed your gender there.
We are all
repent
women,
in dust and ashes.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Carrie Boller, Brittany Mayer, and Melissa O'Connor. Please share that. And we have some more conversations with the Battle Cry coming here in the near future. These are just moms who went down the rabbit hole and have never been the same ever since. And we need other godly men and women to go down the rabbit hole and start learning how we got here so they can lead their families, their churches, and our culture back onto the right track by contending for the truth in the public square within our political regime and form of government, which says you, the people, need to exercise stewardship for the direction of the country. But that starts with information and knowledge to stand in a kooky culture of death like we're in today. If you want to share this episode, go to YouTube, subscribe, go to iTunes, Spotify, give us a rating and review. It really helps us reach more people. We appreciate it. If you want to connect with the White Rose Resistance and become an ally and get equipped as we're hiring and growing to begin mobilizing the church at the local level to push back, go to thewhiterose.life, www.thewhiterose.life. Thank you so much. Until next time, I'm Seth Gruber, and this is Unaborted.